Hello, welcome to a new year, 2021, and welcome to a new trial of memory and engagement opportunity for wellness. I'm your host today, Michelle Hobb. I'm a speech language pathologist and the leader for the Meadowlark Special Programs. As I said, we're going to try something new today. One of the big things that my boys and my husband enjoy doing is watching people do reviews of other people's presentations or performances or educational opportunities, even opening gifts. They watch people opening gifts or trying out new items, new toys, what have you, and then giving critiques or reviews. So I thought it would be fun to try something new today with you as well. So what we're going to do is watch a TED Talk by Dr. Laura Boyd. And then throughout the TED Talk, I will be stopping it to maybe hopefully bring home a little bit more information that will make it feel more relevant to you. Maybe give you some things to think about more. And of course, at the end, maybe even give you some things that you need to try. So without further ado, we're going to start our memory and engagement opportunity for the week of January the 4th, 2021. Here we go.
So how do we learn? And why do some of us learn things more easily than others?
Phew. Well, let's start with that. That's a great way to begin this. How do we learn, and why do some people learn things better or more easily than others? So maybe even more importantly is, how do we remember? This is something that we question all the time as our brains are aging, as we're experiencing new opportunities, different environments in our world right now. That's something that we question quite often. This is also a key topic that I teach and talk about a lot as a speech language pathologist or in our memory classes. What kinds of things do we do to help us remember? Another thing that we think about with this is that you may think, I've already done all the learning I need to do, or my brain's just not capable of holding any more information. It's already too full. Well, I think that this is going to be a great opportunity for you to learn from that that's not the case, and that our brain is constantly changing. In these times of COVID, when we are separated from others, when we're having to learn new technologies such as Zoom or FaceTime, we are ever expanding our brain and what our brain and our muscles have the capability to do. So let's see more about what we can do to help our brains.
So as I was mentioned, I'm Dr. Laura Boyd. I'm a brain researcher here at the University of British Columbia. And these are the questions that fascinate me. So brain research is one of the great frontiers in the understanding of human physiology, and also in the consideration of what makes us who we are. It's an amazing time to be a brain researcher, and I would argue to you that I have the most interesting job in the world. What we know about the brain is changing at a breathtaking pace. And much of what we thought we knew and understood about the brain turns out to be not true or incomplete. Now, some of these misconceptions are more obvious than others. For example, we used to think that after childhood, the brain really could not change. And it turns out that nothing could be farther from the truth. Another misconception.
So did you hear that? Nothing could be farther from the truth than the fact that our brain does not stop learning and changing after childhood. Or even in the case of males, when we always heard that the brain takes until around the age of 23 for the male's brain to completely become developed. This isn't necessarily the stopping point for our brain to keep learning. Thank goodness.
Perception about the brain is that you only use parts of it at any given time and it's silent when you do nothing. Well, this is also untrue. It turns out that even when you're at rest and thinking of nothing, your brain is highly active. So it's been advances in technology, such as MRI, that's allowed us to make these and many other important discoveries. And perhaps the most exciting, the most interesting and transformative of these discoveries is that every time you learn a new fact or skill, you change your brain.
Okay, did you catch that? Every time you learn a new skill or a fact, you change your brain. So here it is. You have the power to change your brain by learning new skills, new facts, and new activities. This is why I love to teach about the brain, because you can control things with your brain. It's never too late to change your brain.
It's something we call neuroplasticity. So as little as 25 years ago, we thought that after about puberty, the only changes that took place in the brain were negative. The loss of brain cells with aging, the result of damage, like a stroke. And then studies began to show remarkable amounts of reorganization in the adult brain. And the ensuing research has shown us that all of our behaviors change our brain, that these changes are not limited by age. It's good news, right? And in fact, they're taking place all the time. And very importantly, brain reorganization helps to support recovery after you damage your brain.
Okay, so again, brain reorganization helps to contribute to the way that your brain continues to learn. So even after damage, such as a stroke or any other type of neurological disorder, your brain can still keep learning and changing. So all because of neuroplasticity. The way I like to describe neuroplasticity is that it's your brain's ability to change and to evolve, to find new pathways and new connections when maybe something else isn't working or when maybe you just need to do something differently. For example, when she's referring to the strokes, we have all probably had the experience of a friend or a loved one who maybe has lost the ability to use their right arm and they're right-handed. So through therapy and lots of the things that you're going to learn about here later in this conversation, the brain rewires, it reconnects pathways to allow that left hand to take over and do the things such as brushing teeth, dressing, feeding, all of those types of things because of neuroplasticity.
The key to each of these changes is neuroplasticity. So what does it look like? So your brain can change in three very basic ways to support learning. And the first is chemical. So your brain actually functions by transferring chemical signals between brain cells, what we call neurons, and these trigger a series of actions and reactions. So to support learning, your brain can increase the amount or the concentrations of these chemical signaling that's taking place between neurons. Now, because this kind of change can happen very rapidly, this supports short-term memory or the short-term improvement in the performance of a motor skill. The second way that the brain...
Okay, so let's recap that. So the brain's neuroplasticity can happen through a chemical change within the brain. So neurons firing causes actions and reactions, which helps with short-term changes in the brain. So those short-term memories, things that you want to remember from maybe the time you hear a friend say a phone number or a date on the telephone, and then you go and you actually write it on your calendar. A short-term action, reaction of those neural changes within the brain from the chemicals to allow you to have that short-term ability.
Brain can change to support learning is by altering its structure. So during learning, the brain can change the connections between neurons. Now here, the physical structure of the brain is actually changing, so this takes a bit more time. These types of changes are related to long-term memory, the long-term improvement in a motor skill. Now, these processes, they interact, and let me give you an example of how. So we've all tried to learn a new motor skill, maybe playing the piano, maybe learning to juggle. And you've had the experience of getting better and better within a single session of practice and thinking, I've got it. And then maybe you've returned the next day and all those improvements from the day before, they're lost. What happened? Well, in the short term, your brain was able to increase the chemical signaling between your neurons. But for some reason, those changes did not induce the structural change that are necessary to support long-term memory. Remember that long-term memories take time, and what you see in the short term does not reflect learning. It's these physical changes that are now going to support long-term memories and chemical changes that support short-term memories. Structural changes also can lead to integrated networks of brain regions that function together to support learning. And they can also lead to certain brain regions that are important for very specific behaviors to change their structure or to enlarge. And so here's some examples of that.
That face that is usually covered by her phone.
So people who read Braille, they have larger hand sensory areas in their brain than those of us who don't. Your dominant hand motor region, which is on the left side of your brain if you're right-handed, is larger than the other side. And research shows that London taxicab drivers who actually have to memorize a map of London to get their taxicab license, they have larger brain regions devoted to spatial or mapping memories.
Okay, so this again is one of the things that I just think is so exciting about our brain. Did you ever take the time to just sit back and process what your brain actually looks like inside? Thinking about, oh my goodness, what part of my brain is bigger, more enhanced, has more details and capabilities than the other parts of my brain? Well, we all have special gifts and we all have special skills, so we can probably assume some of those things. But what do you think are some of those areas within your brain that are larger or more enhanced? Is it perhaps the language area? Is it perhaps the visual spatial area? Maybe it's the reasoning area or the problem solving. Think about that a little bit and process, what are my strengths? What are my greatest benefits for helping others or for helping myself? And I wonder, is that part of my brain enhanced? Is it more detailed or larger? It's pretty fun to think about.
Now, the last way that your brain can change to support learning is by altering its function. As you use a brain region, it becomes more and more excitable and easy to use again. And as your brain has these areas that increase their excitability, the brain shifts how and when they're activated. With learning, we see that whole networks of brain activity are shifting and changing. So neuroplasticity is supported by chemical, by structural, and by functional changes. And these are happening across the whole brain. They can occur in isolation from one another, but most often they take place in concert. Together, they support learning, and they're taking place all the time. So I've just told you really how awesomely neuroplastic your brain is. So why can't you learn anything you choose to with ease? Why do our kids sometimes fail in school? Why, as we age, do we tend to forget things? And why don't people fully recover from brain damage? That is, what is it that limits and facilitates neuroplasticity? And so this is what I study.
Boy, those were a lot of heavy questions, right? Why does one person learn better than another? Why does one child fail in a situation and another child thrives? Why is it that John remembers all of the things that happened in 1946, but his wife, who lived all the same experiences, can't remember any of those things? Why did Nancy recover for her speech from her stroke, but Mary did not? These are such intriguing questions about the brain and how it works and how it learns and remembers. Let's listen for some more to help us understand what we can do and how we can help our neuroplasticity in our brain.
I study it specifically how it relates to recovery from stroke. So recently, stroke dropped from being the third leading cause of death in the United States to be the fourth leading cause of death. Great news, right? Well, it actually turns out that the numbers of people having a stroke has not declined. we're just better at keeping people alive after a severe stroke. It turns out to be very difficult to help the brain recover from stroke. And frankly, we have failed to develop effective rehabilitation interventions. The net result of this is that stroke is the leading cause of long-term disability in adults in the world. Individuals with stroke are younger and tending to live longer with that disability. And research from my group actually shows that the health-related quality of life of Canadians with stroke has declined. So clearly we need to be better at helping people recover from stroke. And this is an enormous societal problem, and it's one that we're not solving. So what can be done? One thing is absolutely clear. The best driver of neuroplastic change in your brain is your behavior.
Okay, so the best drive for neuroplastic change in your brain is your behavior. I don't know about you, but to me, that's pretty empowering. Again, knowing that we can control our brain, we have some abilities to be able to make the changes within our brain and therefore even the quality of our lives. So as she mentioned, stroke is very challenging to recover from, and not everyone recovers in the same journey, in the same manner or practice or function. And why is that? Well, because each of our brains are individuals. Just as we try to establish lifestyles for our residents, for them to be able to keep those lifestyles the way that they've always wanted them to be and the way that they want them to continue in the future, it's the same thing with our brain. We have to figure out what's driving our brain, what our brain needs, and how we can teach it and keep learning and remembering with that. So when I was in graduate school, my neurology professor said, if you want a cookbook profession, you should find the door. And she's exactly right. But that's also what makes me love working with people so much, because it allows me the opportunity to try to figure out what each individual's brain is actually needing, thriving, craving, all of those types of things to help them get to be the best that they can be. So, behavior. What behaviors do you have in your daily life that are encouraging new learning? What do you have that you're doing that's encouraging continued learning? These are the questions I really want you to ponder and to ask yourself as you go through this next week. What behaviors are you controlling? What things are you doing for your brain to help you? Now, we also have to take a moment to think about some of those negative behaviors. Do we have negative behaviors in our life that are affecting our brain's ability to learn and to be neuroplastic in a positive way? Are we not getting the amount of sleep that we need for our brain to truly function well? Are we not giving our brain the proper fuel? Not enough water, not enough fruits and vegetables. Looking at those behaviors and recognizing how our brain makes changes from a chemical, a structural, and a functional perspective, and that with those behavior changes, we can affect that cycle of neuroplasticity.
The problem is that the dose of behavior, the dose of practice that's required to learn new and relearn old motor skills, it's very large. And how to effectively deliver these large doses of practice is a very difficult problem. It's also a very expensive problem. So the approach that my research has taken is to develop therapies that prime or that prepare the brain to learn. And these have included brain stimulation, exercise, and robotics. But through my research, I've realized that a major limitation to the development of therapies that speed recovery from stroke is that patterns of neuroplasticity are highly variable from person to person. Now, as a researcher, variability used to drive me crazy. It makes it very difficult to use statistics to test your data and your ideas. And because of this, medical intervention studies are specifically designed to minimize variability. But in my research, it's becoming really clear that the most important, the most informative data that we collect is showing this variability. So by studying the brain after stroke, we've learned a lot, and I think these lessons are very valuable in other areas. So the first lesson is that the primary driver of change in your brain is your behavior. So there's no neuroplasticity drug you can take. Nothing is more effective than practice at helping you learn, and the bottom line is you have to do the work.
So, how many times have you either said that or to someone else or said it to yourself? Practice and putting in the work. You have to do the time. You have to do repetition, practice, in order to make those changes in your brain. So, if we want to learn a new skill or we want to revisit an old skill that we had, we have to practice. Repetition, repetition, repetition.
And in fact, my research has shown that increased difficulty, increased struggle, if you will, during practice actually leads to both more learning and greater structural change in the brain.
Okay, so again, I know that we talk about this in our classes sometimes too, but if something is easy for you, then you need to change it. Something has to be challenging. You have to keep your brain and your muscles stimulated in order for new learning or learning, new creation of neuroplastic pathways to continue or to be created. So if you enjoy doing crossword puzzles and you're really good at them, then take it to a new level. Either try a harder level of difficulty or try a different type of a word puzzle. Maybe try a numbers puzzle like Sudoku, but challenge your brain. If something is simple or easy, it's time to up the ante and try something more challenging.
The problem here is that neuroplasticity can work both ways. It can be positive. You learn something new and you refined a motor skill. It also can be negative, though. You forgot something you once knew. You become addicted to drugs. Maybe you have chronic pain. So your brain is tremendously plastic, and it's being shaped both structurally and functionally by everything you do, but also by everything that you don't do. The second lesson we've learned about the brain is that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to learning. So there's no recipe for learning. Consider the popular belief that it takes 10,000 hours of practice to learn and to master a new motor skill. Now, I can assure you it is not quite that simple. For some of us, it's going to take a lot more practice, and for others, it may take far less. So the shaping of our plastic brains it's far too unique for there to be any single intervention that's going to work for all of us. And now this realization has forced us to consider something called personalized medicine. So this is the idea that to optimize outcomes, each individual requires their own intervention. And the idea actually comes from cancer treatments. And here it turns out that genetics are very important in matching certain types of chemotherapy with specific forms of cancer. My research is showing that this also applies to recovery from stroke. So there are certain characteristics of brain structure and function that we call biomarkers. And these biomarkers are proving to be very helpful in helping us to match specific therapies with individual patients. And the data from my lab suggests it's a combination of biomarkers that best predicts neuroplastic change and patterns of recovery after stroke. And that's not surprising given how complicated the human brain is. But I also think we can consider this concept much more broadly. Given the unique structure and function of each of our brains, what we've learned about neuroplasticity after stroke applies to everyone. Behaviors that you employ in your everyday life are important. Each of them is changing your brain. And I believe we have to consider not just personalized medicine, but personalized learning. The uniqueness of your brain will affect you, both as a learner and also as a teacher. And now this idea helps us to understand why some children can thrive in traditional education settings and others don't, why some of us can learn languages easily, and yet others can pick up any sport and excel.
So I want to just take a second here and revisit this. When you think about your strengths and your weaknesses, are you a better auditory learner and rememberer? Do you remember things better if you see them or if you actually read and do? These are the different types of learning that she's referencing. And these are things that still, as our brains are aging, we must consider these things in order for us to really optimize the way that we learn, remember, and even teach.
So when you leave this room today, your brain will not be the same as when you entered this morning. And I think that's pretty amazing. But each of you is going to have changed your brain differently. Understanding these differences, these individual patterns, this variability and change, is going to enable the next great advance in neuroscience. It's going to allow us to develop new and more effective interventions and allow for matches between learners and teachers and patients and interventions. And this does not just apply to recovery from stroke. It applies to each of us as a parent, as a teacher, as a manager, and also, because you're at TEDx today, a lifelong learner. Study how and what you learn best. Repeat those behaviors that are healthy for your brain, and break those behaviors and habits that are not.
Let's just regroup here too. So look at how and what your brain learns and remembers. Challenge yourself by finding out those strengths and or weaknesses and using that to your benefit of learning. An example that I might have is that I'm a very visual learner. I'm a doer. I need to see and do. So if someone tries to tell me how to do something and to learn it that way, I'm going to be lost. So what I need to do is be very assertive with that individual and say, hey, I really want to learn this, but I've got to grab a paper and pen and write down what you're telling me. Or I want to hear what you have to say, but let's do it together at the same time. So again, in this time of limited social contact with individuals, this is one of those things that you may have to really be more assertive with your communicators as well. Maybe it's a son or a daughter who wants to teach you how to do something, who maybe wants you to change the way in which you've done something over the last years because it's now becoming more difficult for you to remember. Break it down with your son or daughter. Say, hey, you know what? It's really hard for me to remember and to make these changes without having it written down. Can you write it down or send it to me in an email or bring it in a bring it on text, on paper, typed up, drop it off at the shack and let me look at it so that I can have more success with this. So I encourage you to be more assertive in the way that you know your brain learns best and communicating that to others.
Practice. Learning is about doing the work that your brain requires.
So practice, do the work that your brain requires. So I just kind of gave that example before, but don't practice things in ways that aren't going to sink into your brain, that's not going to make those chemical changes or those neural pathways, the function, the structure, all of those things. Practice repetition in a way that your brain responds.
So the best strategies are going to vary between individuals. You know what? They're even going to vary within individuals. So for you, learning music may come very easily, but learning to snowboard, much harder. I hope that you leave today with a new appreciation of how magnificent your brain is. You and your plastic brain are constantly being shaped by the world around you. Understand that everything you do, everything you encounter, and everything you experience is changing your brain. And that can be for better, but it can also be for worse. So when you leave today, go out and build the brain you want. Thank you very much.
All right. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I think she has some really wonderful points, obviously, or else I wouldn't have gone through this with you. But what I think of when I kind of just recap the whole entire presentation is go and build the brain that you want through repetition, through challenges, today, tomorrow, the tomorrow after that, and the tomorrow after that. We are lifelong learners. Our brain wants to be that lifelong learner. So keep allowing it to be. And again, I know that things are challenging with with having such limited interaction and contact and exposure to the world right now, but there are still things that you can do. Doing, just like we've talked about in previous classes, eating with that non-dominant hand, brushing, combing, fixing your hair with a non-dominant hand, learning new words, coming up and trying new math challenges, but keep your brain stimulated. So also, I want to reiterate that strategies and learning techniques are individualized. So I might recommend one strategy that we try in a class, and you say, that was horrible. That did not help me at all. I felt more confused than ever. And that's okay. You tried it, and now you know that you don't want to continue working on that path. But that strategy may have worked for your neighbor or the neighbor down the road. So that's why we do so many different types of exercises and strategy learning within our classes. So another thing to keep working on is to try and do repeatedly. So remember at the beginning of the session here, she talked about the chemical changes in the brain and how those help with that short-term memory. But in order to get things to go to the long-term memory, we have to keep repeating and repeating and repeating, right? To make that function and structural changes to the brain, those long-term memories, we have to continue down that path of repetition and challenge. So, my challenge for you this week is to think about how you learn best. Is it visual, sensory, auditory, action, a combination of all of the above? Then process and think about that. Then I want you to find something that you either want to learn or you want to relearn and go through that skill again. So my challenge for myself this month is I'm not going to make it just a week. My challenge obviously for the week was to assess what my strengths and weaknesses are. Very aware of those. But then my next challenge is to actually try some new learning. And my challenge for myself this month is calligraphy. Okay, so I love writing notes and trying to do artistic things like that. Painting, I'm no good at that. But calligraphy is something that pretty much since high school, I would guess, maybe even earlier, I've always wanted to learn how to do calligraphy. And I did learn a little bit before I got married so that I could make my wedding invitations look fancy, but I never made it a true practice. So in relationship to our neuroplasticity conversation, I made it a chemical change. It was a short-term change, but it didn't sink into that long-term neural pathways of function or structure. So that's my goal for this month, is to break out those calligraphy pens, get back on YouTube or find some new books and figure out how to start processing that skill of calligraphy into a new pathway, making my brain more neuroplastic. Well, not really, but experiencing more neuroplasticity of my brain by relearning and creating a more solid change in my brain of being able to write in calligraphy. So I hope that you enjoyed this session today. I know it's something new, definitely new for me. And hey, even trying this new learning here was creating some chemical changes in my brain. So Happy New Year to you all. Try something new, assess what your strengths and weaknesses are, and repeat and practice and repeat again. Have a wonderful week. Bye.